Largely unknown to non-Canadians, Mark Carney gained attention last January when he delivered his now famous speech at the Davos Economic Forum, in which he threw a few jabs at the US administration of President Donald Trump. He was not only praised for his courage, but also for his realistic vision of what tomorrow's world will look like. That is a world where we should stop insisting on the respect of international law, on great powers' appetite for imperialistic power, and the need for small and middle powers to find a way to exist and preserve their sovereignty. This speech marked a radical difference with Carney's predecessor, Justin Trudeau, whose vision of Canada's foreign policy remained unclear and, to a large extent, organized around the promotion of progressive values around the world, a quasi-messianic vision of a social experiment that has contributed in the marginalization of Canada worldwide. After more than a year in office, Mark Carney's speech has not only found an echo abroad, but also in Canada, where polls and other surveys are showing his popularity and how Canadians are supporting his global vision. In a certain way, this isn't surprising at all, and this can easily be explained. Mark Carney is skillfully taking advantage of a sensitive nerve for Canadians, namely their anti-Americanism. By doing that, Carney and the Liberal Party have been able to accomplish something that seemed hardly possible a few months before the election. That is, managing to stay in office after 10 years of Trudeauism that had become so despised that polls were suggesting at the time the worst electoral defeat in the history of the Liberal Party and a political landslide victory for a Conservative Party led by Pierre Poilievre. All that was needed for upsetting the odds was a threat of transforming Canada into the 51st state of the United States and to undeservedly depict Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the Conservative Party, as a supporter of President Trump by calling him a maple syrup MAGA. All was this threat sufficient in giving Mark Carney a quasi-majority at the House of Commons, which he has finally managed to obtain a few weeks ago by attracting defectors from the opposition parties, despite his party's terrible economic record, scandals, and popular wariness after a decade in office, simply because emotions and fear are more impactful than anything else in the realm of politics. In other words, whoever is able to instrumentalize nationalism as a political weapon will be able to control people's hearts and minds. In this case, the irrational fear of being swallowed into the American empire. After all, as I've already shown in my research, Canadian nationalism is first and foremost a byproduct of anti-Americanism. So if you will allow me a few minutes, let me just explain how this has happened. Established in 1867, Canada was at that time a British colony, and its English-Canadian population thought of itself as British subjects, an idea exemplified by Canada's first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, who famously said in 1891, and I quote, "As for myself, my course is clear. A British subject I was born, a British subject I will die." Of course, with time, this sense of identity began to fade away, and Canada's collective identity was therefore forced to rethink its foundations away from its British legacy. This debate reached its climax in the 1950s and 60s when Canada gave itself new symbols, with the most important being the replacement of its national flag, the red ensign, in favor of its current flag. For many Canadians, severing the ties with Great Britain marked a profound psychological trauma, as it meant for them the inability for Canada to understand its uniqueness. Exemplified by George Grant's book Lament for a Nation, a Canada no longer defined by its Britishness meant nothing less than its absorption by the United States. Because of English Canada's religious, linguistic, and cultural heritage that is so close to the United States, Britishness was for him and for many others, such as a conservative leader of the time, John Diefenbaker, the core marker of Canada's uniqueness from its southern neighbor. But a solution was found. Anti-Americanism became the ersatz to Britishness, and the sense of being Canadian began to be organized through public policies that were radically different from the United States. For instance, peacekeeping, multilateralism, and international dialogue became the opposite of America's unilateral imperialism, while social democracy and state interventionism the mirror of individualistic public policies. To a large extent, these policies, especially the former, have allowed Canada to develop the respected image around the world that has allowed itself to be regularly elected as a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council for many decades until it stepped away from its approach to collective security. But that's another story. Anti-Americanism has even contributed to Canada's unity, since the recent events that followed the return of President Trump to the White House have shown how the fear of becoming the 51st state has also touched a nerve for many Quebecers who have massively contributed in Mark Carney's latest electoral victory. In fact, as it was once said by a Quebec columnist, and I quote, "Anti-Americanism is today, throughout Canada, the only form of racism not only allowed, but also considered to be politically correct, fueled and encouraged by the political elites." However, it must be said that this sense of collective nationhood has been a bit schizophrenic. If on the one hand, anti-Americanism was a core feature of Canadianness, the fact remains that Canadians have simply got closer to the American culture and way of life over time. For instance, US-made shows are dominating the audience rating in English Canada. A report from the Directors Guild of Canada found that 75% of all TV work in English-speaking Canada was financed by American studios and networks in 2021. Furthermore, the American and Canadian accents are in reality almost undistinguishable from one another, especially those from the US northern states, while Canadians have also largely adopted the US semantic. One good example is baseball, which is a popular sport both in Canada and in the US. Canadians and Americans use many baseball terms in their daily lives, possibly without even thinking about it. For example, ballpark figure, out in left field, and throw a curveball are all terms that are widely used and understood in English Canada. Canada has also largely embraced the more dynamic and meritocratic class structures of America, as well as the US economic structure, labor markets, and entrepreneurial culture, but also its way of life, urban design, and cuisine. Even if it has been spared by this phenomenon because of its distinctive language and massive investments in its cultural ecosystem, many have argued that Quebec is slowly but surely following that path as well, and that its Americanity is now evolving into Americanization. And the distinction between these two terms isn't trivial. While the latter expression refers to the complete adoption of the American cultural norms at the expense of those of the indigenous ones, which is then destined to disappear, the former rather implies embracing these norms as components of our identity that are complementing the indigenous ones. In the case of Quebec's Americanity, its people have managed to adapt their distinctive French-Canadian collectivist norms to those of the United States that are more individualistic, hereby creating a unique French bubble in America. In other words, Quebecers have managed to become American while still managing to affirm their French roots, with the result of feeling strongly and uniquely Québécois, not only while visiting the United States but also when visiting France. And in both of these cases, these countries feel a bit like home, but at the same time also as foreign lands. A form of identity that has been famously exemplified in Quebec cineast Pierre Falardeau's most famous movie, Elvis Gratton, in which the main character is unable to define his identity. So in the movie he says, and I quote, "I'm a francophone French-Canadian, an American francophone from North America." But this is what Americanity is all about. Just like Anglo-Canadians, Quebecers are far more American than Europeans when it comes to class structures, free market economy. Even if we refuse to admit it, Americanity has shaped the Canadian society in ways that have made it what it is today. In the context of North America, unlike Americanization, it is obvious that Americanity is an inescapable reality both for English Canada and for Quebec. The presence of the American cultural and economic hegemon as a neighbor makes it impossible to feign that resisting this pressure can extend beyond elite rhetoric and public policies. After all, countries are not entirely sovereign in their decisions that are rather dependent upon their geography. On the one hand, there is something understandable in Canada's reaction since President Trump's return to the presidency. What we have witnessed over the last year and a half has allowed us to see how anti-Americanism still plays a fundamental role in Canadians' self-understanding of who they are, despite being culturally and historically very similar to their Southern neighbor. As Mark Carney and the Liberal Party, whose leaders in the 1950s and 1960s had been at the heart of the evolution from Canadianness understood as anti-Americanism, have been skillful enough to understand how this notion resonates with the Canadian people and to use it to their electoral advantage. Kudos to the Liberals. On the other hand, there's something completely absurd in thinking that the various boycott campaigns against American products will change anything about our inevitable American destiny. The considerable pressure coming from our southern neighbor cannot be fought, just like it is the case with the Russian pressure in the post-Soviet space. As parents usually tell their stubborn kids, it is what it is, just deal with it. However, the concerning point is that despite being absurd, we may actually wonder if it is not the intention of the current Canadian government to make it an actual reality. The thing is, if the recent attempts at resisting the United States are, as I've said, easily understandable in light of how Canadian nationalism has defined itself over the last three-quarters of a century, they can also turn out to be politically costly and dangerous. In other words, we need to wonder if this type of highly emotional nationalism that has managed to mobilize the Canadian people and to serve politicians' electoral goal isn't leading the country onto a path that will be detrimental to its national interests. Interests that should always be evaluated rationally. And this is the $1 million question. Is it Mark Carney's strategy to enter into a Don Quixotesque fight against Americanity by reorienting Canada towards the European Union up to a point where it might become its 28th member state rather than the 51st American state? Is he trying to exit the schizophrenic attitude Canadians have always had with the Americans by finally cutting the economic and cultural ties with our southern neighbors? To answer this question, the assessment over this matter needs to differentiate two separate aspects. First, the economic, and secondly, what it implies politically. In the former case, few would question the need for Canada to diversify its trade. Since that around 80% of Canadians are living within 150 kilometers of the US border, it is normal that the overall majority of our international trade has historically been with our southern neighbors, despite the largely understandable reluctance on the part of Canadians when discussions over free trade agreements took place, such as in 1888, when the leader of the Liberal Party, John Turner, accused the incumbent Prime Minister during the nationwide electoral debate, the Conservative leader Brian Mulroney, of having sold Canada to the US, an accusation the latter rebuked by saying that nobody had the monopoly over patriotism. And this was an intense moment that exemplified the whole nature of Canada's nationalism and how it has historically framed its politics. In today's world, where around 75% of Canada's international trade is with the US, economic diversifications, which we have been discussing for decades with very limited results, is obviously a necessity that should nonetheless be considered realistically, since it is also obvious that the US will remain our main trading partners because, as I have said, a country's geography will always limit its options, especially when its neighbor is a superpower. In this sense, the recent discussions about enhancing economic opportunities for Canadian companies in Europe are sound, even though they will always remain marginal in comparison with the American market. Thinking otherwise is simply delusional. The Americanization of Canada's economy will always be a reality, whether we like it or not. The political element of this question is for its part more problematic, since these talks have also extended to the possibility of Canada joining the European Union. We can easily understand the attractiveness of such an idea in light of Canada's anti-Americanism. Like I said, since post-Britishness nationalism of the 1950s and 60s, Canada has tried to differentiate itself from the US through progressive policies. And it's no wonder that, as Mark Carney said in March 2025, Canada is the most European country outside the continent because of Europe's rich legacy with similar progressive policies such as universal healthcare and social safety nets. Being like-minded, Canada and Europe therefore share a special political bond that, in addition to their profound anti-Americanism, has led 3 in 5 Canadians to support their country joining the EU, according to a poll conducted last month. What this means is that, fueled by the current psychological environment since January 2025, we might argue that Canada is at a turning point, as it could be moving onto a new national project of Canadianity. A project that seems to go beyond simple economic diversification and that could evolve into a complete rejection of Americanity in favor of the Europeanization of hearts and minds. The European obsession of Mark Carney is indeed undoubtable, as it seems that to him, being almost European actually means not being American, which is, as I have said, completely inaccurate. Indeed, after being sworn in office as Prime Minister last year, his first visit wasn't in Washington, as it is traditionally the case with every new Canadian Prime Minister, but in London and Paris. He has also attended earlier this month in Yerevan, where I'm currently living, the 8th European Political Community Summit as its first ever non-European attendee. In light of different surveys made recently, we can say that he has the support of Canadians who would most likely give him an increased majority in Parliament if elections were to be held. But this is where nationalism can be a tricky game. Lying upon emotions and irrational fears, because let's be serious for a second, Donald Trump isn't going to kidnap Mark Carney in the middle of the night like he did with Nicolas Maduro. This source of mobilization can for sure play in favor of politicians' electoral strategies in a way that can nonetheless seriously hurt a country's interests. Firstly, would it be possible in the first place for Canada joining the EU? And even if it might be the case, what would be the consequences for Canada? Would Canadians be willing to adopt Europe's heavy regulations, high taxes and open border policies that could further reinforce the current economic problems of Canada? What Canadians seem to be forgetting at the moment is that two things can be true at the same time. While it's true that President Trump's attitude to Canada has been aggressive and ineffective, they should also remember that shifting economically and politically towards Europe is not going to erase their Americanity, and that it might lead to more negative than positive consequences. Despite the current difficulties Canada is having with the US administration, its long-term interests, that is, economic growth, technological innovation and border safety, lie with America and not with the European status model that is less and less able to provide its people with material prosperity and safety. But that is what reason ought to dictate. And unfortunately, Canada's national narrative makes it impossible to think this way. On the contrary, in light of how Canadians have thought of themselves since the 1950s, Donald Trump's policies are perceived by a majority of Canadians as the quintessential example of what they have always feared, that is, a borderless empire that had always been targeting the northern part of the continent. And it's true that President Trump's rhetoric is largely contributing in fueling that fear. Mark Carney has therefore a wide-open boulevard in front of him for completely reorganizing Canada's policies in a way that might be detrimental to the country. Yes, Canada might be the most European of non-European states, but at the same time, it is also the most American of non-European states. And in this sense, what appears to be at first sight as a natural union between Canada and the EU might actually be a union of entities that have more differences than similarities.